Hey guys, we're following up on our interview in the last video with David Cancio, who was talking about his journey towards becoming a author in the near future, and he's been doing this with by working with his dad. So I want to talk to him about what it's like working with family. How's that journey going?
So working with family, um, if you didn't have an indication of what that's like based on the laugh I just had, um, working with family it's probably one of the hardest things that you'll ever do. Um, my dad and I are very, very strong-minded, very stern people, um, very stern individuals. And the difficulty with this is, so he's a more accomplished writer than I am in terms of his ability to write songs, ability to compose music, in terms of being able to create. He's been around a lot longer than I have, and that's not just his age, but he's certainly more accomplished than I am in terms of really the different mediums that he's expressed himself with. So poetry, etc. I'm nowhere near as good of a poet as my father. I'm nowhere near as good of a children's author as my father. Um, Certainly not a songwriter like my father is, and I can't. I'm basically tone deaf, so forget about me composing music. However, um, what I think I do excel in is being a novelist, being able to take short stories and novels and being able to set up the right rhythm. Because ultimately, if you look at movies, if you look at very successful books, etc., it comes down to a certain amount of key factors. So the first factor, um, I would say it's one of the biggest factors, and the biggest show of this is probably Game of Thrones, the TV show versus obviously the novels. The novels are appropriately paced because they've taken all this time. They're written at the whim of George R. R. Martin. The problem with the TV show is that it outpaced the books because the books took so long to make, which is a thing we'll talk about later. Um, we will get to that. But basically, if you look at the TV show, one of the biggest problems that people had with it at the end was its pacing. The biggest problem with novels is pacing.
Right.
With anything is pacing. How do you in theory you're going to have kind of like this. You're going to have your rising action. You're beginning your rising action, then you get to your climax, and then you have your falling action, then you have your conclusion. And so you want it ultimately to look like this, or at least kind of look more like this. What you don't want it to be is, like that.
Right.
You really don't want it. You don't want it to be that way. And you certainly want to make sure that it's even toned in terms of writing the first parts to be really, really well done, and then having other parts, that complement it and are at the same level. What you don't want it to be is, this is really great and this is really bad. This is really great and this is really bad. You don't want that. You want it to be very consistent. It's better to write a very bad book that's even than to write a book that has different, sporadically good parts and terrible parts, because consistency is what people want in an ever-changing world. But when it comes to working with my father, the difficulty that we have is he is an attorney who's far more practiced than I am in terms of law. He obviously understands the cases more than I do. So the difficulty is that while I am quote unquote the lead writer, he is the lead experienced guy. So, and he's my father. So at the end of the day, there's certain levels of seniority. It's very difficult to have a business relationship with someone that you're family with, especially when you have a relationship where this person is your superior and you are that person's subordinate. Even though now, as an adult, I would like to claim that I am equal, but as any parent will tell their child, you are still my child. What's it like working with family? It's a blessing. I'm very lucky that my father is alive at 68. I know that some people don't have that same luck. I'm very grateful that my father has allowed me to be able to tell him, hey, this makes sense to you as a lawyer, but we have to dumb this down, or we have to rewrite this, or we have to change this. Not changing what a lawyer would actually do. The one thing that I will say about our series is that at no point is a lawyer going to look at it and go, okay, that's really unrealistic. That's not going to happen. And we don't want to write it that way, because if you look at shows that have had long-standing success, such as Law and Order, Law and Order is an extremely successful show. And if you ask any lawyer, if you ask anyone who's in law enforcement, they will tell you at least 80% of it is absolutely true. These are the procedures that would be taken. This is how a lawyer would react. This is how, et cetera. But that's also, the show was produced and I think created by Dick Wolf, who's obviously excellent, has incredible background, really knows his stuff. And we wanted to err along those lines. So working with my dad, we both had to come up with a conscience idea. We had to get together and decide what the plots of each novel was going to be, who the characters were going to be, what that was like, where the setting was going to be. Why did we choose to write about this time period? Well, because of, this interesting time in Miami, which, like I said, Miami in the 1980s is very similar to what the United States and a lot of countries are experiencing nowadays. Miami had massive waves of immigration that came in then. The world is now seeing it in other places. Miami's not the only place where immigration has happened. It's obviously happened throughout history. But it just so happened that what Miami went through there is very similar to what we're seeing around the world. The race riots that happened last year with Black Lives Matter and obviously the different factions that came into play there. Miami went through that. Miami actually had, I think, 7 race riots in 10 years. And some of them were really, really bad. Just a lot of heat, if you will. Writing a book with my dad is the same thing as starting a business with any family member, right? You have to get together. You have to come up with a cohesive plan. You have to have deadlines. If you do not have a deadline, it's going to be terrible. Will you completely jump over those deadlines? Yes. We started this project on the 21st of April of 2017. We are now on the 1st of August of 2021. It has been 4 years in the making. We have written 2 novels, completely. I mean, obviously the editor is going to make his final edits, obviously before we get into actually mass production. But for the most part, they're written. We're talking the changes here are like a chapter here that needs a little bit of refining, maybe a couple thousand words here, maybe take out a couple thousand words there. That's about it. But they're pretty much done. 2 of them are done. The third one is about halfway done because we already have the source material that we're adapting. And so now, when I look at it, there's still 4 more books to go. Now, this is in the midst of a global pandemic, the world being on absolute fire, job changes, personal injuries like when I tore my ACL in 2018, job changes like when I lost, when I changed jobs in 2018 as well. I was going to say when I lost, but me losing weight really had nothing to do with with being able to. I guess I was more focused because I had less things to worry about. I was in better health. But when you're talking about writing with somebody, you're talking about really a higher level of accountability. And there are times, where I won't even want to talk to my dad. And I'll tell you this right now. There were plenty of times where he didn't want to talk to me. There were plenty of times where I'm pretty sure my father took a good look at like a bat in a corner and wanted to hit me with it because he's like, that's not what lawyers think. And obviously the same thing when I'm like, lawyers think this way, but nobody can understand you because you've written it in such legal jargon that it's impossible to understand. So, that's really the fine line of these things. And when you're working with a family member, it is, like I said, it's a blessing because I can sit back, and say, hey, I didn't just do this. I did this with my dad. It's really neat to be able to say that I at 30 could do this with my dad.
Yeah,
despite the age gap, despite this, despite that.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
absolutely. Yeah, because I know other people I know that work with their family. Usually, it's more like working with a established business. It's not a creative venture with each other, which obviously leads to some more outside of business, self-actualization type goals.
That makes no money.
Right now, yeah, exactly. But
that makes no money.
That's called a passion project,
No, I know.
But yeah,
I know.
I get it. It's more risk, which definitely leads to, I'm sure, more stress and yeah. It's a challenge, but it's a very cool experience that I haven't had, and I feel like it's good to normalize that conversation so that other people understand what those challenges are before getting into it.
Yeah, and everybody always thinks it's going to be sunshine and rainbows, and I'll be the first one to tell you it's not. If it's sunshine and rainbows, with family and you're working with them, you're either extremely blessed because you just think exactly the same way, or you're really oblivious to what is truly happening. And I don't say that like light, you know. If there's one thing that I can tell you, it's that it's made me better as a person. Because you're talking about an extra set of feelings when you're working with your family. You can't just go up to your dad and tell your dad like, this is terrible. You know, I have, and
Right.
he's done the same thing to me. Now, at the same time, like I said, it's not like it's some random person that I'm doing business with. This is terrible. Which of course I'd probably end up being nicer to that person than I would my own father. And my father, likewise, because we've had this relationship for so long, would tear into me. There was a time, I can tell you this. I wrote something. I wrote a dialogue scene between two attorneys that was a little bit different from what he had written, because kind of the format that we had was that he would write the rough draft. I would, and not the whole novel. He would write like the rough draft of a chapter if it had something to do with like a court scene or something. Because I've never been a lawyer. I'm not going to be a lawyer, at least not that I know of. And I've never had to litigate. I couldn't tell you what that's like. I couldn't tell you what a lawyer's thinking or what a lawyer's feeling. My father can, which is part of the reason why we write together, because we are writing about a lawyer figure. But so, he will write that scene. And then what will happen is that I will read it and I will add whatever I think needs to be added. I will change around a couple words. For example, and this always happens, you'll find this with rough drafts. You'll kind of find one or two words that you really like that you'll end up repeating like 10 times. And in good writing, you shouldn't have that, etc. But when you're writing a rough draft, you're not conscious of these things because you're just simply trying to get it down in the most, in the, not going to say the quickest way possible, but ultimately you're just trying to get it out of your head and onto the paper. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Forrester, it's a fantastic movie. It has, the late Sean Connery and Rob Brown, I think his name is what his name is. But, it's this transgenerational, transracial, if you will, relationship between this white elderly Scottish man who lives in New York and this impoverished, younger, very bright, incredibly talented younger man who wants to be a writer. He's a brilliant basketball player, but what he wants to be is a writer. And I dare say that when I saw this movie, I had to have been like 9 years old. So I think it actually has a huge influence of why I became a writer. But when they start writing together, the older man, who's William Forrester, is working with this younger man and teaching him how to write and teaching him that there are 4 drafts. Your first draft is basically your plow. Your second draft is, he said the first one's from the heart. The second one is when you start using your head. And when you start using your head, basically you start cutting out the words that need to be cut out. You start trimming the fat. The third one is when you start to get to be more efficient. And what I mean by that is now in your third draft, it's not just like you're plowing it down. You're just coming out with this, or you're thinking about, is this logical or that, like you would in your second draft. But your production, your actual in the zone writing is better because you're already cutting out things that you don't need to have in there. You're more streamlined with your writing. You're using more adjectives and you're using a wider range of nouns and verbs and adjectives, etc. You're not using the same ones over and over again. You're conveying different emotions. And the fourth draft is pretty much when you've done your final everything and it all comes together. And that's really what it takes to produce a book. In writing with my dad, we've had probably 20 drafts for certain things. We've had 2 drafts for others. Simpler stuff, we've had 2 drafts. Much more complicated stuff, we're talking we've had 20 drafts where we go back and forth. We've cut out entire sections of a book. We're talking we've cut out 20,000 words before because we realized that, at 20,000 words, just for anyone's kind of reference here, think about a 300-page book. We cut out like 50 pages of it, if not more. And so you're looking at that and you're going, okay, well, you cut out 50 pages of a book here. What are you going to do to fix that? And so these kind of things come into your head, and you have to really, like I said, you have to really plan it out. You have to really know what you want. Your message, the characters' journeys, etc. All those things have to be clear. So what's it like working with your family? It is a very tedious, wonderful, blessed process, but you have to make sure at the end of the day that you're not willing to sacrifice your family for the product. And that's what makes it difficult. When you have a non-familial relationship and it's a business relationship, if one person wants out, they can get out and you can still continue with the project. If my dad turns around tomorrow and says, what, I don't want to publish the book anymore, forget this, I can't do anything with it because it's his work and he's my family.
Right. Yeah, no,
unless, and that's tough. That's very
absolutely.
tough.
Absolutely. It takes a, understanding, like you were saying, with him working on one aspect where he's much better at, you work on another aspect, you're much better at understanding your role in that while
Yeah.
still in a semi-forced relationship. Like that,
Yes.
because that's really the stress that we're talking about. Like anytime we have a relationship that is not completely arbitrary, then that's when we have those stressors. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, and
no,
it can be, and it's tough. But at the end of the day, like I said, you have to remember that the other person. At the end of the day, children are a reflection of their parents in many ways, and I believe that parents are the mirror to which children kind of look at themselves, and say, do I stack up to this person? Have I matched my father? I can tell you this, in terms of a father, my father is. If I'm half the father that he is, one day my kids are still going to have an amazing father. Of course, right now my imaginary kids, because I'm neither married nor do I have my own house or anything. So that's again a conversation for later. But when it comes to being a writing partner, he's despite everything, despite the things that I joke about, us being hard headed and being difficult, he has been great. He's been very patient with me. Um, because my biggest issue is that while I can produce as I have been told, so that no one thinks that I'm calling myself a brilliant writer here, but um, as I have been told, I do have an exceptional talent with writing. It's very engaging writing. It's not the most beautiful, but it is engaging, which is a very difficult thing for most writers to have. But what I have been told is that, while I can be very engaging, my level of productivity at times can be very inconsistent. And what is found often is that you have these writers that are very, very brilliant, and then they're very inconsistent, which is why they don't succeed. It's the same thing with sports athletes, right? You have some athletes that show up, Jeremy Lin Sanity, incredible, and then he was gone. And then you have other people who've done, and that's not a play on Jeremy Lin.
of course. I'm just
He's
understanding.
right. He's far more talented than I could ever be at basketball. Not even. And if I'm ever as talented in writing as he was at basketball, I will be a very happy.
Oh, of
But
course.
it's one of those things where it's like you look at LeBron James. LeBron James is world class talent, legendary talent with incredible consistency. Dwayne Wade, same thing. John Elway as a quarterback, same thing. Tom Brady. Let's not even talk. He's the
Right.
greatest winner of all time. So you can have these flashes of brilliance, but you have to be able to develop the discipline to remain consistent. And if you look at John Grisham, if you look at Stephen King, if you look at any of these writers that are commercially very successful, but then also, um, very, very good authors. Bernard Cornwell is another one who's maybe not as commercially, well, definitely not as commercially successful as those two, but an incredible author who produces amazing works that are now really beginning to be adapted through Netflix and other mediums. Um, he's an incredibly consistent author. He puts out a book basically every 11 months. And I don't know if he has a research team or if he does the research team all by himself. I don't know if he is his own research team. I imagine by now he probably has his own team. But he writes historical fiction. It's incredible. George R. R. Martin said that his works had the greatest battle scenes that he had ever read. You're talking about George R. R. Martin, this now
Right.
cult famous writer for writing Game of Thrones, saying that Bernard Cornwell had the greatest, battle scenes that he had ever read. I can tell you, as someone who's read Cornwell a lot, probably more than I should. I think I've read like 16 of his books. Shout out to him because I did send him a letter once, and he sent me back a book plate that was autographed. So thank you.
That's awesome.
But you know, you have these authors that have these amazing abilities, and at the end of the day, it does come down to consistency. So the greatest thing about writing with my father is having an accountability partner, having somebody that looks at me and says, "You need to get this done." Grisham is so focused that he wakes up. I think he wakes up. I can't remember if it's at 6 o'clock in the morning or at 7, but basically he's in his, you know, he's in basically like a giant shed that he has in his backyard. I think it's like a guest house, and he's given several interviews on this. But he gets in there, starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, writes until about 12, goes to his house, prepares lunch, relaxes, maybe watches a little bit of TV or something, whatever it does. He does that for an hour, takes his mind off the writing, goes back to his guest house and writes from 1 o'clock until 5. And that's why he's able to produce as many books as he has. I think that he's produced, 40 novels. You have the Rainmaker, you have the Rainmaker, you have the Pelican Brief, you have the Firm, you have A Time to Kill. You have all these different novels that he's written that have obviously become adapted to different works, obviously being movies. And you look at that and you say, he's been very, very successful in terms of his adaptations. Well, why? The man has a very, once he got past book one, I guess actually past book two, the Firm is really what put him on the map. Once he got his second book out there, he was able to develop his consistency level. And so the advantage that I have of working with my dad, my consistency's gotten better because I have a 68-year-old man looking at me going, you haven't sent me the chapter. Get me the chapter so I can do my work. So that's what it's like working with my dad.